Would you do anything to save someone you love? Studies show that, in extreme situations, 90% of people act purely on instinct, disregarding fear and danger. Now, imagine being a 12-year-old kid faced with the most daring decision of your life. In this video, you'll discover the unbelievable story of a boy who didn't think twice before stealing a police car to save his mom from a kidnapping. It's a tale packed with courage, tension, and twists that feels like it belongs in a blockbuster action movie, but it's 100% real. Get ready to dive into every detail of this gripping journey, where a young hero proves that love knows no bounds and bravery often comes from the most unexpected places. Stay with me until the end, because the conclusion will shock you in ways you could never imagine. Greenridge was a town where the loudest sound after dark was usually the chirping of crickets. Its residents prided themselves on knowing their neighbors, sharing greetings at the local diner, and trusting that nothing extraordinary ever disrupted their routines. For 16-year-old Marcos Martinez, this sense of predictability was comforting. He lived in a modest home on Maple Street with his mother, Clara, who worked tirelessly as a nurse at Greenridge Memorial Hospital. Clara had always been Marcos's anchor. Her gentle smile and unwavering determination kept their small household afloat, even as she worked long hours to provide for them. That night, as she left for her evening shift, she kissed Marcos on the forehead, promising to return by 11 p.m. "Don't stay up too late," she said with a playful smirk, knowing full well he'd likely lose himself in his favorite video games. Marcos laughed. "You know me too well." The hours passed quickly as Marcos immersed himself in an online battle with his friends. Midnight approached, and he glanced at the clock. Clara was late. It wasn't unusual for her shifts to run over, especially when emergencies cropped up. But something about tonight felt different. By 12:15 a.m., a knot of anxiety began to tighten in Marcos's chest. He tried reasoning with himself. Traffic. A last-minute patient. She'll be home soon. Yet, his unease grew with every passing minute. Finally, he grabbed his phone and dialed her number. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. "Hello?" he said, relief briefly washing over him. But the voice on the other end wasn't Clara's. Marcos Martinez? The voice was male, deep, and cold, each word dripping with menace. Marcos's blood ran cold. "Who is this? Where's my mom?" "Listen carefully," the man interrupted, his tone sharp. "If you want to see your mother alive, you'll do exactly as we say." In the background, Marcos could hear muffled sobs. His heart sank as he recognized the sound of his mother's voice. "Mom!" he yelled, his voice breaking. "What are you doing to her?" "Shut up and listen," the man growled. "You have 1 hour to bring us $50,000. Don't call the cops, don't try anything stupid, or she dies. Understand?" 50,000. Marcos stammered, his mind reeling. "I don't have that kind of money." "Figure it out," the man snapped. "You have 60 minutes. We'll be watching." The line went dead. For a moment, Marcos sat frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. His hands trembled as he tried to process what had just happened. Clara, his mom, the strongest person he knew, was in danger, and there was no one to help. Marcos paced the living room, his mind racing. $50,000. Where would I even begin? His first instinct was to call the police, but the man's warning echoed in his head. If they were watching, he couldn't risk it. He thought about neighbors, but none of them were wealthy enough to lend that kind of money. His uncle Javier, who lived 2 towns over, might have been able to help, but there wasn't enough time to contact him and return within the hour. Marcos sat on the couch, gripping his hair in frustration. Every ticking second felt like a countdown to disaster. Suddenly, a thought struck him. What if I could track them down myself? But how? He didn't have the resources or the skills to locate the kidnappers. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something through the window. A police cruiser parked at Buddy's Diner across the street. The officer inside was casually sipping coffee, his phone in hand. A wild idea began to form in Marcos's mind. The police car. It has GPS, a radio, tools I could use. His pulse quickened at the thought. It was reckless, illegal, and dangerous. But what choice did he have? He peered outside, scanning the street for signs of activity. The town was quiet, the perfect cover for what he was about to do. Slipping on his sneakers and grabbing his jacket, Marcos stepped out into the cool night air. The cruiser was parked just a few steps away, its interior illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. Marcos's heart hammered in his chest as he approached. He glanced through the diner's window. The officer was still seated, scrolling through his phone, oblivious. Marcos reached for the door handle, his hands trembling. To his shock, the door was unlocked. He slid into the driver's seat, his breath shallow. The keys were in the ignition, as though fate had handed him an opportunity. For a moment, he hesitated. Am I really doing this? But then he thought of Clara, tied up and terrified. He couldn't let her down. Turning the key, the engine roared to life. Marcos flinched, expecting the officer to come running, but no one appeared. He put the car in gear and pulled away, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. As he drove, the police radio came to life, crackling with voices and static. Marcos's adrenaline surged. He had no idea how to use the equipment, but he was determined to figure it out. He had 1 hour, and the clock was ticking. This is how Marcos's desperate journey began. A choice born out of love and fear, one that would thrust him into a world of danger and deception he couldn't yet comprehend. The small, quiet town of Greenridge would never be the same. Marcos's fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The faint hum of the police cruiser's engine was barely audible over the deafening thud of his heartbeat. He glanced at the dashboard, which glowed with a confusing array of buttons, screens, and the police radio. The streets of Greenridge were eerily silent at this hour, their tranquility a stark contrast to the chaos in Marcos's mind. His mother's muffled cries replayed in his head, a haunting soundtrack to his frantic drive. The cold realization hit him. He had no idea what he was doing. Marcos's first instinct was to figure out how the cruiser's equipment worked. He spotted the GPS display mounted on the dashboard, its digital map showing the surrounding area in vivid detail. His fingers hovered over the touchscreen. He tapped aimlessly, searching for anything that could help him. Come on, he muttered, his voice trembling. The map zoomed in and out, but there were no leads, no flashing markers pointing him to the kidnappers. Frustrated, he slammed his hand against the console. Then the radio crackled to life. All units, be advised, Cruiser 214 reported stolen from Buddy's Diner. Suspect last seen heading north on Elm Street. Marcos's stomach dropped. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting flashing lights to appear at any moment. His mind raced. How long before they catch me? He shook his head, trying to push the thought aside. Focus, Marcos, he whispered to himself. You have 1 hour. As he turned onto Elm Street, the cityscape changed. The cozy, well-lit homes of Greenridge gave way to dimly lit streets and abandoned lots. It was the part of town Clara always warned him to avoid. Marcos tightened his grip on the wheel. He needed a plan. He needed help. His first thought was Jake, his best friend since elementary school. Jake was clever, resourceful, and maybe reckless enough to help him pull this off. But Jake lived across town, and Marcos couldn't risk wasting precious minutes on the detour. Next, he considered heading straight to the hospital. Clara had co-workers who might know more about the situation, but the kidnapper's warning rang in his ears. Don't call the cops, don't involve anyone. He was running out of options and time. As he drove aimlessly through the dark streets, a flash of blue light in the rearview mirror sent a jolt of fear through him. At first, he thought it was another police cruiser, but as the lights drew closer, he realized it was just a beat-up pickup truck with a broken headlight. Still, the false alarm rattled him. He swerved into a side street, his tires screeching against the pavement. The truck passed without stopping, but Marcos remained on edge. They're watching me. They have to be. He thought of the man on the phone, his cold, calculating voice. The kidnappers had sounded so certain, so in control. Marcos felt like a child playing a game he didn't understand, with rules stacked against him. Then he saw it, a faint glow in the distance. A small convenience store stood at the corner of the street, its flickering neon sign casting long shadows across the pavement. Marcos pulled into the parking lot, his mind racing with possibilities. The store was deserted except for an older man behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. Marcos hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the cruiser. As he entered, the man looked up, his eyebrows raised. "Late night? Huh," he said, eyeing the police uniform draped over the driver's seat. Marcos nodded stiffly, trying to appear calm. "Yeah, long shift." The man grunted in response and went back to his paper. Marcos quickly scanned the aisles, looking for anything that could help. His eyes landed on a display of prepaid cell phones. An idea sparked in his mind. He grabbed one and rushed to the counter. "This," he said, placing the phone on the counter along with the crumpled bills from his pocket. The man rang it up, moving at an infuriatingly slow pace. Marcos glanced nervously out the window, half expecting the real police to burst through the doors. Finally, the transaction was complete. Marcos tore open the packaging and activated the phone. He typed in his mother's number, his fingers shaking. The line rang once, twice, then connected. "Marcos." Clara's voice came through, faint but clear. "Mom," he cried, relief flooding his chest. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "They've blindfolded me. I'm in some kind of warehouse." The sound of footsteps in the background made Marcos's blood run cold. "What are you doing?" the man's voice demanded, cutting off Clara's response. The line went dead. Marcos stared at the phone, his heart pounding. He clenched his fists, anger and frustration bubbling inside him. A warehouse, somewhere in Greenridge. Determined, Marcos ran back to the cruiser. He needed to find every warehouse in town and check them one by one if necessary. But before he could even start the engine, the police radio blared again. "Unit spotted near Maple and Fifth. Requesting backup." Marcos froze. Maple and Fifth was just a few blocks away. They were closing in. His time was slipping through his fingers, and his only chance to save Clara was slipping away. With a deep breath, he gripped the wheel and floored the gas pedal, racing toward the unknown. He didn't know how this would end, but he refused to let fear paralyze him. The quiet streets of Greenridge were no longer a sanctuary for Marcos. They had transformed into a labyrinth of danger, with every turn potentially leading him straight into the arms of the police. The cruiser's engine roared as he sped through the town, his mind racing even faster than the vehicle beneath him. The police radio, a relentless reminder of the trouble he was in, crackled with updates. "All units, suspect in stolen cruiser reported near Maple and Fifth. Proceed with caution. Suspect considered dangerous." Marcos tightened his grip on the wheel, his palms slick with sweat. "Dangerous? I'm just a kid trying to save my mom." The absurdity of the situation struck him, but there was no time for reflection. The game of cat and mouse had begun, and Marcos was the mouse. As he turned onto Fifth Street, the flashing red and blue lights of a pursuing cruiser appeared in his rearview mirror. His heart sank. The officer from Buddy's Diner must have realized his car was missing and raised the alarm. Now, the chase was on. The pursuing vehicle's sirens wailed, shattering the eerie stillness of the night. Marcos's chest tightened as the officer's voice boomed through the loudspeaker. "Pull over now. You're only making this worse for yourself." Marcos ignored the command, his mind focused on one thing: his mother. He pressed the accelerator, the cruiser lurching forward as he swerved into a side street. The tires screeched against the asphalt, and he narrowly avoided clipping a parked car. The streets blurred as he drove, his adrenaline pushing him to the edge of his abilities. He had never driven before, his experience limited to watching YouTube tutorials and playing video games. The real thing was far less forgiving. Every turn felt sharper, every stop more urgent. His lack of skill became painfully obvious when he took a turn too wide and the back tires skidded dangerously close to a lamppost. The pursuing officer gained ground, his lights flooding the interior of Marcos's stolen vehicle. The police radio crackled again, this time with a calm but commanding voice. "Unit 214, this is dispatch. We have a location on the suspect's mother. Possible hostage situation at the old Greenridge lumber warehouse. Backup en route." Marcos's pulse quickened. The kidnapper's location was no longer a mystery, but now the police knew too. If they reached the scene before him, the kidnappers might panic and hurt Clara. He couldn't let that happen. He took a sharp right, aiming to lose the pursuing officer, but the man was relentless. The wail of the siren grew louder, its piercing cry a constant reminder of how close he was to being caught. Suddenly, Marcos's path was blocked by a delivery truck idling in the middle of the road. He slammed the brakes, the cruiser screeching to a halt just inches from the truck's bumper. He didn't have time to think. The officer was closing in fast. Spotting an alley to his left, he threw the car into reverse and veered into the narrow passage. The sides of the cruiser scraped against the brick walls, sparks flying as he barely squeezed through. The pursuing officer was forced to stop, the alley too tight for his vehicle. "Damn it!" the officer cursed, his voice faint but audible over the commotion. Marcos emerged on the other side of the alley, his heart pounding as he floored the gas pedal. For now, he had bought himself some time. As he sped through the quieter streets, his mind began to clear and a sliver of hope crept in. He replayed the dispatcher's words, Greenridge Lumber Warehouse. He knew the place. It had been abandoned for years, a relic of the town's bygone industrial days. Reaching over to the passenger seat, he grabbed a map from the glove compartment. He unfolded it with one hand, his eyes darting between the road and the paper. The warehouse was on the outskirts of town, a 10-minute drive if he avoided major roads. His plan was simple: get there first, confront the kidnappers, and save his mom. The part of him that knew how reckless this was had gone silent, drowned out by desperation. But fate wasn't done testing him. As Marcos approached the edge of town, he noticed headlights in the distance. A second police cruiser was patrolling the area, likely searching for him. He quickly turned off the main road, entering a winding dirt path surrounded by trees. The car jolted and bounced on the uneven terrain, but Marcos didn't care. He needed to stay out of sight, no matter the cost. Branches scraped against the windows, and the path grew darker as the trees closed in around him. He turned off the headlights, relying on the faint moonlight to guide him. The eerie quiet was broken only by the sound of gravel crunching under the tires. He hoped the darkness would hide him from the patrols. Finally, the forest opened up, and the outline of the warehouse came into view. Marcos stopped the car a safe distance away, killing the engine to avoid drawing attention. The silence was deafening, the only sound his own ragged breathing. He stepped out of the cruiser, his legs shaky but determined. The massive structure loomed ahead, its rusted metal walls reflecting the faint glow of the moon. He could see a faint light coming from one of the windows, proof that someone was inside. Taking a deep breath, Marcos crept toward the warehouse. He had made it this far. Now came the hard part. Marcos stopped the cruiser behind an abandoned warehouse to catch his breath. He stared at the dashboard, trying to figure out how to operate the GPS. Then he heard a soft knock on the window. Startled, he turned to see a girl about his age standing outside. Her hoodie was pulled up, and her piercing green eyes locked onto his. "What are you doing in there?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. Marcos hesitated. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he was running out of options. "My mom's been kidnapped," he blurted out. "I need to find her." The girl's expression shifted. "You're serious?" Marcos nodded, his eyes pleading for help. She climbed into the passenger seat. "My name's Tessa. I know how to work these systems." Marcos didn't question her sudden willingness to help. He was too desperate to care. Tessa began fiddling with the onboard computer, her fingers moving with practiced ease. "I used to hack stuff for fun," she explained, almost casually. "Let's see if we can trace the call." As Tessa worked, Marcos felt a flicker of hope for the first time. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Tessa than she was letting on. Tessa's fingers danced across the police computer, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the screen. Within minutes, she located the origin of the call Marcos had received. "It's coming from an old industrial park on the outskirts of town," Tessa said, pointing to the map. "If we hurry, we might make it." Marcos nodded, gripping the wheel. "Let's go." As they sped toward the industrial park, the police radio crackled with updates about the stolen cruiser. The authorities were closing in, but Marcos didn't care. Saving his mother was all that mattered. When they arrived, the place was eerily quiet. Abandoned buildings loomed like ghosts, their windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Tessa pointed to a faint light coming from one of the warehouses. "They're in there," she whispered. Marcos's heart pounded as he got out of the car. He didn't have a plan, but he couldn't back out now. Inside the warehouse, Clara was tied to a chair, her face streaked with tears. Two men stood nearby, one of them pacing impatiently while the other kept watch. Marcos and Tessa crept closer, hiding behind a stack of crates. Marcos clenched his fists, anger boiling inside him. He was ready to charge in, but Tessa held him back. "Wait," she said. "We need a distraction." Tessa grabbed a metal rod from the floor and threw it across the room. The loud clang startled the kidnappers, causing them to look away. In that split second, Marcos sprang into action. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice trembling but determined. The men turned, startled to see a teenager standing before them. One of them smirked. "And what are you going to do, kid?" Before Marcos could answer, the sound of sirens filled the air. The kidnappers exchanged a glance, realizing their time was up. "Get her out of here," one of them barked. The other man grabbed Clara and began dragging her toward the back exit. Marcos lunged at him, but he was easily overpowered. Just as the man raised his fist to strike, Tessa appeared, wielding the metal rod. She swung it with all her strength, knocking the man to the ground. The other kidnapper tried to flee, but the police arrived just in time, surrounding the warehouse. Officers stormed in, weapons drawn, and apprehended both men. Clara was freed, and Marcos embraced her tightly, tears streaming down his face. The nightmare seemed to be over, but something didn't add up. The police began interrogating the kidnappers on site. One of the officers turned to Marcos and Clara. "This wasn't just about ransom money," he said grimly. "These men were hired to send a message." Marcos frowned. "A message? To who?" The officer hesitated. "Your mother." Clara's face went pale. She looked at Marcos, then at the officer. "I don't understand." But deep down, Clara did understand. There was something she hadn't told Marcos, a secret she had buried for years. Back at the police station, Clara finally broke down. In the quiet of an interrogation room, she confessed the truth to Marcos. "Before you were born," she began, "I worked as a nurse for a man named Victor Reyes. He was powerful, dangerous. I found out he was involved in illegal activities, smuggling, money laundering, worse things. When I threatened to expose him, he let me go on one condition. I had to disappear." Clara paused, her voice shaking. "I thought I was safe here in Greenridge. I thought he'd forgotten about me. But he hasn't." Marcos stared at her, stunned. "So this wasn't random? They were after you?" Clara nodded. "And now they know where we are." The next morning, the police informed Clara and Marcos that Victor Reyes was one of the most wanted men in the country. The kidnappers were low-level enforcers working for him. Their capture meant one thing: Victor would retaliate. The FBI got involved, placing Clara and Marcos in protective custody. But Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that running wasn't the answer. He turned to Tessa for advice. "I think we need to fight back," he said. "We can't keep living in fear." Tessa hesitated, then revealed her own secret. Her father had been one of Victor's victims. She had been tracking Victor for years, hoping to find a way to bring him down. Together, they hatched a plan to use the information Clara had gathered years ago to expose Victor's entire operation. With Tessa's hacking skills and the FBI's resources, they uncovered a trove of incriminating evidence against Victor. But as they prepared to take him down, Victor struck first. He sent his men to ambush the safe house where Clara and Marcos were hiding. In the chaos, Tessa revealed her true motive. She wasn't just seeking revenge for her father. She had been working undercover for Victor, feeding him information. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Marcos, tears in her eyes. "I didn't want it to end like this." But in a shocking turn of events, Tessa double-crossed Victor. She had been playing both sides, gathering enough evidence to ensure his downfall. In the final showdown, Victor was captured, thanks to Tessa's betrayal and the FBI's intervention. Clara and Marcos were safe, but their lives would never be the same. As they watched Victor being led away in handcuffs, Marcos turned to Tessa. "Why did you help us?" She smiled faintly. "Because some battles are worth fighting,"